Hello, everyone. Hi. I'm Minko. I work on Angular at Google, where I lead developer relations. I'm really excited to be here today. That's my second in-person NG Poland after 2019. It makes almost 3 years since I came here for the last time. And after that, the world stopped for a little bit. Angular has been a pretty important part of my professional and also personal life over the past many years now. Back in 2013, I opened my very first pull request to a major open source project, which was Angular.js. I added just a single line to the documentation, but it enabled me to do way more over time. Many more contributions to Angular and to different web products. Angular also supported me personally when I transitioned from Bulgaria, from my hometown, all the way to Silicon Valley. I started organizing the meetups of the San Francisco meetup. And this helped me find my community, like-minded people, all these relationships, some of them turned into friendships. So it was pretty tough to not be able to see my community over the past 3 years since COVID. That's why I'm happy that we're here today, and we'll be able to spend the day in chatting about Angular, the web platform, and more. Last time I was here in 2019, I was just promising that we'll be finally releasing Ivy, right? And it took us about 3 years to rewrite the whole framework and to make sure that we're providing a backward compatible interface. Well, Ivy is out now. It already started providing some of the benefits that we promised back then, and we even got rid of our previous rendering, Vue Engine. Today, first, Emma is going to start telling you everything about some of the top features we shipped over the past year or so. After that, Alex, who leads the framework, is going to talk about how we're going to build Angular in the future. He'll be talking about reactivity and also hydration. And at the end, I'm going to come back here on stage to talk about how we're building all this with different groups within Google and also with the external community. So, Emma.
Thanks, Minko. Yeah, so as we've been delivering all of these things in the past, Ivy, we've been moving countries, we've been working as a team together, we've been heads down trying to make Angular better, but we've also spent a lot of time. We've also spent a lot of time listening. I think a big core tenet of how Angular feels we can improve for the future, and our major way of strategizing of what that future looks like is listening to you, right? That's why our team is here today. We're excited about the hallway track of having conversations about Angular and how you're developing. But we also listen in many other ways, right? Every year, we do an annual developer survey, and we're overwhelmed and thankful for the engagement that developers like you give to filling out that survey and giving us critical feedback of how you feel we can make Angular better. It also allows us to look for patterns of maybe places that Angular can do better, or common development practices of how when you go and build your apps every day, things you're seeing and errors that you're running into. We also listen by issue triaging, right? I think Angular's biggest strength is that it's open source. And a huge part of open source means that anyone can open an issue or feature request or bug on our public GitHub. And we want to make sure that we're not just seeing those, but we're also listening to the feedback that you're giving us in our GitHub repository by directly looking at those issues and triaging them. And so over the past couple years, as we've been heads down on all these projects, we've also really committed to reducing our issue backlog and triaging those issues, which means implementing them in the last 2 versions, so both version 14 and version 15 coming up. We will have closed the #1 issue on our GitHub repository. And obviously, when you close the #1, a new one becomes #1, and that helps us understand what you want as developers. So in the last couple years, we have gone from over 3,000 issues on our GitHub repository to just under 1,000, and we continue to meet weekly with each of our teams to continue to look at those issues and triage and see how we can improve the framework. But we also listen in other ways, right? More recently, we have focused on listening to not only developers like you who are using Angular, but also developers who aren't using Angular. And we want to understand what architects and decision makers think about when they think about choosing a framework. So this includes understanding what's keeping people from learning Angular at the start of their development journey, and also what people are deciding when they decide which framework to choose. And on the Angular team, that means that we've been doing something new on the team and actually building with Angular, right? So we at the Angular team are privileged to be framework engineers who are actually building Angular, the framework, but that doesn't always mean that we get the chance to build large applications at scale. That's why listening to you all who have these massive applications in enterprises or your personal website who are building with Angular every day is so important. But we've gone one step outside of that, and not only are we building with Angular, but we're also excited because we've spent time looking at other frameworks, building with them, understanding and taking inspiration from how they're doing things differently or similarly, and what we can learn from those other frameworks. And really what it all boils down to is we've noticed that the core focus of what we have listened to and understand is improving the developer experience. Developer experience is definitely new. When Angular was invented years ago, this wasn't even a term in development, right? This wasn't a term we were talking about. This just wasn't a word in the development practice of what frameworks were targeting. And it has definitely become an increasing thing that we're sort of searching for as a North Star of creating the best developer experience for you as developers. And when we look at developer experience as our large focus, we found two specific sub-themes of what we've heard that we want to improve in. And the first thing is improving the learning curve and experience of learning Angular. So we understand right now that there's a lot of mental models and concepts that you need to learn to get to just deploying your first app, right? Angular has all of these different things, and there's this great satisfaction when you get that first app going and you understand it. But we want to understand how we can take that cliff of learning and make it more incremental. So make it so that you can get to feeling that satisfaction earlier in your learning experience and that it can be a more incremental process. And the other theme of developer experience that we want to focus on is the world outside of Angular, right? Angular is opinionated. Angular is really good at providing you built-in solutions, but once you go outside of that realm of familiarity and try and interact with these other concepts that are becoming popular in developer experience, we don't always have answers, and so we want to come up with answers. So within developer experience, our two focuses are reducing the learning curve and reducing the cliff when you leave that well-supported Angular world and try and interact with other things within your development experience. So I want to talk about the things that we're doing right now that focus on these. Because if we look at what we're already delivering in version 14 earlier this year, and version 15, which will come out on November 16th, a lot of what we're already delivering is directly focused at these developer experience goals. And the largest one is standalone components, right? Standalone components are the idea that we reduce the need for developing with modules in your Angular apps. And that directly focuses on removing one of the concepts of the mental model of Angular in your learning experience. So you can get to that first app quicker without needing to understand the ng module experience. And we hope that that improves the learning experience and complexity of your applications. But that's not just it. We also spent the time to release standalone components under developer preview with the idea that all of those APIs could be tested. We could go and put that on the universe, and we could listen to you, we could hear your feedback, we could collect all of that, and we could know that we could put a check mark next to it, and that you would like it, And luckily, that's what happened in version 14. And so in version 15, we are excited to release standalone components as stable. And along with that, we've had the chance to integrate standalone components with a bunch of our API surfaces that actually improve the framework as a whole, right? It has improved the router significantly. It has allowed us to revisit all of these different APIs on our surface and make them better along the way. And of course, it also allows us to break some of those tricky inheritance restrictions. Another thing coming in version 15 in just a few weeks is the directive composition API. This was the #1 feature request on our GitHub. So again, going back to that listening theme. But this also allows you to add directives directly to host elements and create a much more readable surface for your components you're creating, right? So here I have my singular component of a menu, but I'm directly calling these host directives of a tooltip and a menu, and I'm being explicit about the API surface I'm giving that component, and I'm applying those directives directly to the host element. So this becomes a much more readable and much more manageable way to build your Angular components. Along with that, standalone has brought a lot of improvements to the router, including lazy loading of components, a config API, and massive improvements in the tree shakeability of the router, as well as functional router guards. And of course, version 14 also brought significant improvements outside of standalone, such as the inject function, which within your routes allows you to do some pretty cool things with routing. Now, outside of the framework, we've also seen some pretty cool improvements in developer experience within Angular Material and the CDK. So the component developer kit allows us to provide you primitives that allow you to build your components, and we give you the business logic, and you get to decide what it looks like. So in version 14, we prioritized taking some of the primitives that we build our Angular Material components with and making them available for you so that it's easier for you to build your own custom components. Version 14 included both the menu item and dialog. And in version 15, we're continuing this trend of trying to make the things we build with accessible to you, and we're adding the list box. Now, the other thing coming up in version 15 that I'm super excited about is MDC-based material components. So MDC-based material components have existed for a while, but they're finally going to be default and stable and delivered to you directly from the imports you're already using of your Angular material components. And the benefit, if you're like, what's MDC, is that we take the core primitives that Material as a team supplies us, and we build our Angular material components on top of that. So that adds a layer of abstraction where we no longer own the specs, which means that Angular material is significantly closer to the material design space of what that design looks like. There's accessibility fixes, there's visual improvements, and it also means a modernization for web styling as a whole, right? With the deprecation of IE11 support, we can now use modern styling on the web, which brings really cool improvements to design tokens, to CSS variables, to all this stuff that allows you to style your applications in a much more modern and scalable way. But these aren't the only things that our team is working on, right? We're continuously listening. We're looking for ways to improve the developer experience. And so while these are features we're delivering right now that we think significantly improve the developer experience, we're also exploring longer-term projects of things that we think will continue to improve the developer experience. So we have some current explorations happening, specifically focused on some of the other topics that we're hearing, again, in conferences, in hallway chats, on GitHub, all of these places we're listening. And those include documentation, so not only delivering an easier way to develop with Angular, but also documentation to support that learning journey. Hydration, reactivity, accessibility, better components, build speed, all of these things that we know are highly requested by you that we want to deliver thoughtful explorations and answers for. So I want to introduce Alex next to talk about some of those explorations and how we're thinking about them. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. Don't want to go backwards. All right. Hello, NG Poland. My name is Alex Rickabaugh. I am the technical lead for the Angular framework team at Google, and I'm very excited to be here in person. It's kind of weird coming in person for the first time to a conference that I've already presented at before. I did a virtual talk a couple years ago. So my goal today is to give you a couple of details on some of the bigger technical updates that we're looking on making to Angular and why we might be doing that. So I wanted to start by pointing out, even though it might seem kind of obvious, that Angular is always evolving. And I want to mention that because we are strongly committed to stability and backwards compatibility and delivering updates incrementally. But we also know that Angular's not perfect. Like any technology, it has bugs, it has things which are kind of inconvenient or don't just work the way they were designed to. And so I want to talk about two of those things today and what we're going to do with them. And it's interesting to point out that Angular.js, the first version, was 10 years ago. It's been over a decade. And the web has changed dramatically in those 10 years. These are just a few of the technologies we could think of that have come or gone since that first version of Angular. And the job of the framework is very different, right? We used to be in the business of smoothing over kind of crazy browser incompatibilities. And as Emma mentioned, now we're a lot more focused on development experience and development velocity. And we've gotten a lot of feedback over those 10 years. We've closed about 30,000 GitHub issues since we started this thing called Angular. I personally find this to be a really amazing and privileged position to be in. There are not many web technologies that have survived for 10 years, let alone have as engaged of an audience as we do. It's amazing that we're all here together. And to be able to look at the original assumptions that went into making Angular what it is, and kind of see which things worked out the way we intended, and in which things do we see kind of cracks forming where they're not working quite the way they were designed. That's really cool to be able to do with the feedback that you've given us. And so today we're going to talk about two topics, reactivity and hydration. So let's dive in with reactivity, right? What is that? Reactivity is the name we have for how the framework takes changes in your model, your data model, and synchronizes them into your UI, your view. So from the blueprint to the actual DOM. And in Angular, our reactivity system is known as change detection. So it works like this, right? Whenever something happens in the application, like the user clicks a button, your application might change its data model somewhere. And then Angular gets notified about that. And we start kind of at the root component and descend down into children and kind of check and evaluate the templates along the way until we've managed to synchronize the whole UI back with the model. And Angular's approach here is actually really flexible. Generally, you can store your data anywhere you'd like. You can mutate it any way you want to. And the framework just kind of figures it out for you. You don't have to think about it. So you can put your data in deeply nested objects. You can update it by changing properties. You can push new values to arrays. You can change objects inside arrays inside properties, right? There's no special API you call, no wrappers, no getters or setters. Angular will just figure it out for you. Except sometimes it's a little more complicated than that. So here in this user profile component, we have an ng after view checked lifecycle hook, and for whatever reason, we need to update the current name. And if you've ever tried this in an Angular application and made changes that look something like this, you may have encountered one of our more familiar errors, right? Expression changed after it has been checked, grammatically correct. And so it turns out that in ng after view checked, you can't just update the model in any way you want. you can make changes that change detection will miss because it's in the middle of checking your components, and it's already checked that one. And that's what this error is trying to warn us about, that our UI and our model are in danger of becoming desynchronized. So we can resolve that by refactoring our application, maybe not trying to push data against the direction of change detection. Or you could put a set time out there, right? We've all done it. Yeah. This just schedules a new round of change detection, and there we can update whatever we want. And sometimes this is the right answer, even if it's feels a little bit hacky, right? But this points at a larger problem. There's a pretty big asterisk attached to this concept of just working. Because it turns out sometimes this magic fails. And when it fails, it can be pretty jarring. You go from just writing your application, not having to care about change detection, to really having to understand in detail what's going on in order to fix this problem or work around it. And there's no simple and clear answer here. There's no direct rules to follow. The mechanics of what you can change and where can be a little bit subtle and hard to reason about. And from the feedback we've gotten from you, most Angular developers will hit this point working on real applications. It's not that change detection isn't doing its job. It's not broken, right? It's just not as hands-off as we intended it to be. And this is something we can fix. So we're looking at how we can update our reactivity system in Angular to smooth out this developer experience and not have such large jumps in what you have to understand. The second topic I wanted to talk about is hydration, which has to do with server-side rendering. So if you load a normal client-side rendered Angular application in the browser, the server will send down HTML that looks something like this. We have our application component, and inside of that we have some kind of like loading indicator. In this case, it's just an H2. And in the browser, that looks something like this, right? This is what the user sees while they're waiting for the JavaScript to download. And ideally, they won't have to look at this very long before the client-side application bootstraps. But for some applications, even a few hundred milliseconds of that is not good enough, right? We really want to make a good impression and show our UI as fast as possible. So when it really matters, it makes sense to render the whole UI on the server with server-side rendering. And then we send down the DOM that actually represents our real application. So the user sees the content they're expecting from the first moment. But it's important to note that this is a bit of an illusion, right? Because this page is static, it's not actually interactive. To make it interactive, we need to do something called hydrating it. Hydration is the process of attaching that client-side interactivity to make the application come to life to the server-rendered DOM. It's the transition between server-side rendering and the reactivity on the client. And today, Angular uses a process we call destructive hydration. It works something like this. So we server render the application, the browser is showing that server rendered DOM, and we're downloading the JavaScript for the app in the background. And when everything is ready to go, we actually completely delete the server rendered DOM, right? That's why it's destructive. And we bootstrap the client-side application, which generates new DOM. And hopefully, if everything is right, that new DOM looks exactly the same. And then we put that into the document instead. And if you do this correctly and synchronously, the user doesn't actually notice, right? You've erased the old application and rendered one that looks identical in its place. Except sometimes they can notice. So if the user happens to start interacting with forms in the application before this hydration takes place, they start typing in their information, and then we delete that DOM. And we render new inputs that look the same as the old inputs, but we've lost the work the user did, and we've lost their place, their focus in the page. There are ways to kind of mitigate this and replay events and things, but no solution here can really address all of these edge cases. What we really should be doing is reusing the existing server-rendered DOM and just adding the client-side interactivity on top of it, right? This is non-destructive hydration. And it's not a new idea. In fact, most newer web frameworks do their server-side rendering this way. And thanks to Angular Ivy, we expect we'll be able to convert Angular server-side rendering to non-destructive hydration. So that's something we're working on doing. Non-destructive hydration is the first step. But there's actually a lot of innovation in this space at the moment. Different frameworks are playing around with some new and really cool ideas. And so we're paying a lot of attention to this space. We're putting together a roadmap of things we want to look into and research. Things like partial hydration, where we don't hydrate components that aren't necessarily interactive. Or lazy hydration, where we don't hydrate something until you interact with it. The space is moving very quickly, so we're keeping a close eye on it. So that's all I wanted to cover at the moment. Angular is always evolving. If we see that there are real problems to be fixed, real improvements to be made, even if those things are in core areas of the framework, like reactivity and hydration, then we're going to invest in fixing them. And we'll deliver those improvements, as we always have, with deliberate, incremental, and backwards compatible updates. So thank you very much. I'd like to bring Minko back to the stage, who's going to tell us about partnerships.
Thank you, Alex.
Cheers.
So yeah, just like everything that is happening in the world, we don't work on Angular in isolation. We have a lot of partnerships, and we work with different groups, both within Google and outside of the company. Luckily, Google is one of the leading forces, I'll say, in the web space and also in the machine learning space. We're really happy and fortunate to be partnering with Chrome directly through their initiative, Aurora. How many of you here know about Chrome? Right? Yeah. Probably that's going to be the wrong event for you if you haven't heard about Chrome, right? Chrome really wants to make web successful, the web platform in general. The web platform is a great open space where we can develop our applications in a very decentralized way. And to make the web platform successful, we need to make sure the developers are building high-quality applications that users want to use, right? So that's why Chrome developed a set of user-centric metrics called Core Web Vitals. They try to kind of put a number on the user experience and give you actionable steps how you can improve the user experience. One of the initiatives under Chrome is called Aurora. Aurora, they help web frameworks such as Angular be successful with Core Web Vitals. So it's Aurora we have been partnering for like over a year and a half now, and we have been mostly building some small incremental improvements. For example, build time optimizations to speed up runtime, inlining Google fonts, Adobe fonts as well, and using critters for critical CSS inlining and more. We're really happy to share that in 2023, we'll be putting our partnership on another level. We will be working even closer together on other initiatives. For example, Alex mentioned hydration. This is going to be one of our core focuses in 2023. Alex also mentioned about the very dynamic, growing space of server-side rendering. There is the destructive hydration, there is hydration after that, non-destructive hydration, there is partial hydration, there is this lazy hydration or resumability that Mishko is probably going to talk about later. All that is pretty exciting, and all these different approaches have their trade-offs. Unfortunately, there is no silver bullet. So we would like to take our time to see where the space moves by also working on improving the server-side rendering experience in the meantime, and make a decision, make a deliberate decision that is going to enable developers to build better user experiences. One of the major things that we ship with the Aurora team in version 14.2 in developer preview is the image directive. Pretty much you need an image element within your template, and to enable optimizations, all you need to do is just update the SRC attributes to ng SRC. From here, the image directive is going to do its magic, it's going to optimize your images to an extent, or also give you actionable guidelines on how you can make your application faster by using different practices. We already observed, like some of our partners experimented with the image directive, and we saw 75% improvement of the largest contentful pane, for example, for Land's End. Kara is later on going to talk more about this. But just a couple of hints. First, the image directive is going to be stable in version 15. That is coming up next month. And it is bringing some improvements. Automatic generation of src sets so that you can reduce the size of the images that you need to download from CDNs, and also experimental fill mode. A lot of developers have complained that setting explicitly the width and height might be a little annoying, so we would like to see how we can fill within the parent container. And talking about web performance, I would like to share a little bit about one of my passion projects. Back in 2018, I applied for a conference. And I was thinking, well, what should I talk about? Maybe just machine learning, because it's very popular, very hypey, and also web performance. And I was like, well, let's see if I can build a tool for predictive prefetching. Why not? So I applied for this conference. It ended up being accepted, my talk. So I had to build this solution. That's my conference-driven development. And ended up developing Guess.js. Together with the Chrome team. Actually, back then I was not a Googler. I was just coding in my spare time for fun. Adi Usmani from the Chrome team presented Guess.js at I/O 2018, and that was kind of like a crazy moment. I was super excited to see that happen. And you can imagine how much happier I was when I joined Google, and the TensorFlow team, like, they just sit one floor below me. So I was able to talk to them and see how we can generalize the solution and make it even smarter with better prefetching. So one of the projects that we developed together in partnership with TensorFlow is introducing machine learning to the JavaScript toolchain by taking data from Google Analytics, piping it to BigQuery and Dataflow, building a TensorFlow.js model, actually a TensorFlow model, that we later on convert to TensorFlow.js, and we execute in a service worker. So we make predictions where the user may want to go so that we can fetch the corresponding resources and store them in the service worker cache. This brought some significant improvements. It's a good proof of concept, but in order to make it production ready, we would like to hear more about use cases. And if you're interested in this particular use case, I would really love to chat about it with you. You can find how this works in the URL at the bottom of the slide, or you just Google TensorFlow Angular predictive prefetching, and you're going to find it. So these are only two of the partnerships that we have within Google. We have been also working closely with Cloud, with Firebase, with different web standardization groups and more. We have been also working a lot with different groups from the community as well. You know, like traditionally people define Angular as an opinionated platform where we just provide best practice and we provide the tools that you need to develop scalable web application. But being in this space, we got tricked a couple of times. We started maintaining some of these tools that we consider to be best practices ourselves. So we ended up being in the business of developing end-to-end testing framework with Protractor, building a linter, building a testing framework, and so on and so forth. But Angular is really good for developing user interface. And also, end-to-end testing, and more, they ended up advancing in the meantime in terms of developer experience. So we have tools such as Cypress, which provides just fantastic developer experience for developing end-to-end tests. So we decided just to meet developers where they are. Rather than trying to chase with particular tools, we will still provide an opinionated approach with different testing commands, with different best practices and style guides, but use also developer tooling that are popular in the ecosystem. We started as first with our linting experience. So we partnered with James Henry on ESLint. Before that, we had TSLint, but this tool got deprecated. And ESLint is a great alternative that was kind of like adopted as a standard approach in the JavaScript ecosystem. So now the good thing is that if you install the Angular CLI, you don't have to bring all the hundreds of dependencies of ESLint. But if you run ng-lint and we see that you need linting, we're going to automatically install the ESLint builder for you. And we did that with ng-e2e as well. We ran a couple of surveys. We saw that most developers are using already Cypress or alternative solutions. And not that many developers are actually using the already outdated Protractor. So we worked with the Cypress team, with the Nightwatch team, and with WebDriver.io to introduce alternative testing solutions. And in 2023, we will be looking at our ng test experience as well, where we'd like to partner with different popular tools from the ecosystem and meet developers where they are. And a core part of this is understanding what developers actually need. So if you're an Angular developer, if you've been an Angular developer for a while, I'm sure you have seen the Angular developer survey. It's, to my knowledge, the biggest front-end survey with about 25,000 responses every year. And we really draw like a lot of conclusions, and it really informs our roadmap to a big extent. So when you see it in a couple of weeks after we get our security approval to release it, please make sure you feel it. You share your feedback so that we know what to do with Angular to make your experience as developers better. On one of these surveys, we noticed that people struggle with debugging. Alex already shared expression has changed after it has been checked. The very grammatically correct error that is very common and not trivial to fix. That was one of the problems. We looked into the responses, the open-ended responses further, and we discovered that error messages are actually kind of confusing, right? Taking over half of this pie chart. Dependency injection and change detection were also kind of like challenging areas that we liked to improve further. So we took an initiative for improving the debugging experience, our debugging excellence initiative, where we first looked at error messages. We identified the top error messages that developers are getting just by looking up how often, how many results there are on Google search, how many people have complaints on GitHub, looking at Stack Overflow and more. We prioritized them, and for each one of them, we developed a unique error code and a unique guide page on Angular.io, which explains what this error is all about, how you can fix it, and just gives you general guidance on how to handle it. And also we partnered on video creation. So currently you have an experience similar to this one here. Let's say your head expression has changed after it has been checked. You get a unique URL that you can click on, and you're going to preview this guide on Angular.io that explains everything in detail. And if you're more of a visual learner, you can directly look at the video to get a better understanding how to handle this error, how to fix it. That was another partnership with the community. We couldn't work and develop all that in isolation, so we worked with Fireship.io. And to help folks understand better how change detection works, we developed Angular DevTools. So now, here it is. So now when you open Chrome DevTools, you can start profiling your Angular application in the profiler of DevTools, and you're going to see each individual change detection cycle as it occurs, so that you can figure out redundant change detection cycles, or you can see where the slowdown of your application is coming from. Originally, we released DevTools for Chrome, and it automatically worked for Edge as well. But we got a lot of feature requests for Firefox. So in version 14, we released it. And also, Apple reached out to us to figure out how we can develop support for DevTools in Safari as well. And we have the Safari support. You can see how I can install Angular DevTools on Safari at the URL below. But dependency injection is another challenge, right? It's not obvious what are the dependencies of your components sometimes. It's not obvious what their dependencies are, or where all these dependencies are coming from. Because there are different injectors in your application, and the dependency resolution process is not straightforward to figure out all the time. So in DevTools, we're experimenting with better tooling for dependency injection. The good thing about Angular is that it is kind of like an opinionated and well-integrated solution. So the dependency injection is part of the framework, and DevTools can make assumptions about it. Same with routing and other tools, but don't want to spoil the roadmap for DevTools. So now when you click on a particular component, you'll be able to preview all the dependencies of this component in this injector section here. And for each one of the dependencies, you'll be able to preview their dependencies and where they're coming from which injector. For a more holistic view, you can preview this tree. Which injector has what providers and how they relate to each other. This is still in developer preview, but you can install it right now. It's live on the Angular GitHub, and you can find instructions how to install it on the URL at the bottom right of the slide. Now let's go back to the pie chart. There is lots of confusion around errors, right? And with a couple of guides, we don't really believe that we resolved all this confusion. There is definitely still an opportunity for improvement. Luckily, though, there is another organization in Google, Chrome DevTools. So we partnered together to improve error messages for everyone by improving stack traces. Just to tell you how complicated a stack trace could be, here is a very simple Angular component. We just have an app component with a loading flag and an async submit method here. We first set the loading flag to true. After that, we send a request, and we set the loading flag to false. I mean, not perfect code, definitely not handling some corner cases here, but, well, it's good for this example. So how complicated the stack trace coming from this piece of code could be? Well, something like that. How many of you understand why this error actually happened? Anyone? I'm glad I don't see any hands. Yeah, just it's completely obscure. I have no idea either, and I'm working on Angular. So we have only one relevant call frame name, which is the app component.ts. We know that something happened there, and that's it. The rest, I see we have Rx.js, we have Zone.js, and if we expand the stack trace, if we get more call frames, we're going to get some part of the Angular runtime as well. So with Chrome DevTools, we worked on a couple of improvements. First, we'd like to make stack traces relevant by removing all these redundant call frames that are coming from Node modules. Now you can see that the stack trace is way shorter, provides less context, but this context was not very useful anyway. It was just about some code that you didn't touch and you didn't have to touch. The next thing that, the way this works actually is, in the Angular CLI, we append some information to the source map for each individual file that is coming from Node modules. And when Chrome DevTools loads this data, it just ignores everything that is coming from Node modules by default. If you want to override this behavior and still see the dependencies coming from Node modules, you can do that. The next thing that we did was to also make the stack traces linked. So we are pretty much stitching asynchronous stack traces. If you have scheduled macro or micro tasks, we're going to take the stack traces coming from them and stitch them together to show you a more holistic view of how everything got executed. And the good thing is that in JavaScript, ignoring service and web workers, things are happening in a single thread. So this really provides some overview, some insights into the sequence of execution as well. This happens through the new async stack tagging API that Chrome developed, which allows us to use Zone.js and instruct Zone.js on how to use it to stitch these asynchronous stack traces together, and shows the way of execution, the flow of execution, all the way from clicking on in this case, a button in the app component. After that, going through submit, sending a request, invoking fetch, all the way until the error happens. And finally, we'll be working on making these stack traces friendly as well. So I'm sure you saw this generated code by the Angular compiler. We would ideally like to point directly to your Angular template. This is still coming soon. There are a lot of source map logistics that we'll have to do, and we'll likely have to connect to the TypeScript team. So this is still work in progress. But this is going to be part of the Angular version 15 release. And the best thing about it is that it works out of the box with the Chrome debugger. So if you start stepping into different functions, you don't have to worry that you're going to step into Zone.js or Rx.js and you're going to get lost there. I know that this has been my personal experience, at least, for a while, and this finally resolves it. It also shows you the proper stack trace on which we can work a little bit to make it a little more readable. Well, that's what we had for you today as part of the keynote. I guess the couple of takeaways are that we have a couple of main focuses. First, we would like to enable performance by default. We would like to enable you to be on the fast path. This is one of the main goals of our partnership with Aurora. Investment in server-side rendering and also enabling best practices by default by building tools such as the image component and more. We're also working on improving developer experience holistically. We're currently looking into the framework. We would like to make sure that we simplify the APIs so that we don't have such a steep learning curve. We would like to reduce what is not necessary to be part of your learning journey and also improve reactivity and hydration. And last but not least, we would really like to leverage the tooling ecosystem. We have been working with different framework and tooling authors, and we would like to continue these collaborations so that we can make sure that we meet developers where they are, and we're partnering for a more holistic solution. That's everything we have for you today. I'm looking forward to chatting with you all throughout the day today and also during the Q&A session at 6 p.m. today. Thank you.